They said she was a nuisance. They said her cats were a health hazard. So they fined her, harassed her, tried to shame her. What they didn't know is that my mother oversees public health for the entire state, the woman they tried to silence. She writes the very policies they're now violating, and she doesn't play games. My mom has always had a soft heart, especially for strays. Ever since I was a kid, she'd bring home injured birds, lost dogs, and yes, cats. But it wasn't hoarding, it wasn't chaos. Everything she did was clean, organized, and safe. She built a small, screened patio enclosure out back where 5 or 6 neighborhood cats could sleep, eat, and rest. They weren't pets, they were rescues, waiting for proper homes or vet care. She handled it all with grace, quietly, privately. That changed when she moved into the Stonebridge Oaks community, a neighborhood run by an HOA that made the DMV feel friendly. On the surface, the place looked perfect. Clean sidewalks, painted fences, zero crime. But underneath, a seething layer of power-hungry board members who policed lawns like border checkpoints and knocked on doors for mailbox violations. My mom didn't know what she was walking into. It started with a letter, of course. Animal-related concerns have been reported at your property. You are advised to remove all outdoor animals within 72 hours to remain in compliance with HOA. Health and sanitation guidelines. That was the exact phrasing. Cold. Robotic. No one knocked. No one called. They didn't even ask if it was true. They just assumed. She calmly replied with a typed letter, explaining that the cats were all spayed, vaccinated, and temporary, that she followed public safety protocols for animal care, protocols she helped design, by the way. She offered to provide health documentation and even suggested an in-person visit. She never got a response. Instead, 3 days later, she received a $600 fine. I still remember the day she called me, furious but composed. "They're fining me for helping animals," she said, "for following the exact policies I approved as department head." I blinked. "Wait, they don't know who you are?" She laughed bitterly. "Apparently not, and I was trying to be nice." That's when I knew this wasn't going to end with a phone call. 2 HOA reps showed up the next day while I was visiting her. One of them, a woman in her 40s with a tight ponytail and clipboard glued to her hand, started taking pictures of the backyard from the sidewalk. My mom opened the door and calmly asked them to stop. The woman responded, "This is a matter of public health." I almost choked. Public health? To her? My mom tilted her head slightly. "Do you even know what qualifies as a public health violation in this state?" The woman stammered something about biohazards and animal waste. My mom nodded slowly, then walked back inside without another word. That's when I knew she was officially done playing nice. She didn't yell. She didn't post online. She went straight into strategy mode. That night, she pulled out a folder thick with documentation. Vaccination records, photos, permits, timestamps, health inspection reports, and city animal control correspondences. She wasn't bluffing. She never did. She was building her case, and as she laid it all out on the kitchen table, she said to me, "They wanted a lesson in public health? Let's give them a masterclass." The next morning, the HOA doubled down. They posted an official notice on my mom's door, bright orange, taped with thick black borders like some kind of crime scene. It read, "Final notice. Unapproved animal activity detected. Further violation will result in daily fines and escalation to legal action. No signature, no explanation, no attempt to speak like human beings, just threats." It was almost funny, if it weren't so insulting. They were trying to scare the wrong woman. My mom took the notice, read it slowly, then neatly folded it in half and placed it in her filing cabinet. "You know," she said calmly, "I've shut down clinics for less than this." That wasn't a threat. That was a statement of fact. She'd spent 20 years building and leading the state's Department of Public Health. She'd seen hospitals misuse medication protocols, animal shelters running in filth, even nursing homes trying to cover up infestations. But 5 vaccinated monitored cats in an outdoor shelter? That was the line in the sand? She decided to give them one last chance. 1. She drafted a letter on official state letterhead, not as a resident, but as the current acting Minister of Health. It was formal, clear, and precise. She cited the exact health codes the HOA was misinterpreting. She included documentation proving there was no violation, and even offered to host a voluntary inspection with the local animal services team. She ended it with a respectful line. Please consider this an opportunity for mutual understanding rather than unnecessary escalation. A gift. A chance to save face. They didn't take it. 3 days later, the HOA president herself showed up. She didn't knock. She stood on the sidewalk, arms folded, lips tight, flanked by 2 other board members. My mom stepped outside. I watched from the kitchen, pretending not to eavesdrop. The HOA president launched into a speech about community standards and optics, and how some residents were complaining about the image of stray animals. My mom raised an eyebrow and said, "Would you like to meet the cats?" Silence. Then the HOA president said it, the line that sealed her fate. "Ma'am, just because you say you know the rules doesn't mean you get to make them." I nearly dropped my coffee. My mom paused. Then she calmly replied, "Actually, I do. And if you had taken 5 minutes to research who I am, you wouldn't be standing here embarrassing yourself." She walked back inside and left them standing there. That night, the gloves came off. My mom sent a letter to the Office of Municipal Code Enforcement requesting an immediate review of the HOA's legal authority to issue health-based citations. She copied the city's health department, the Animal Welfare Bureau, and the District Legal Counsel. She included all correspondence, photos, threats, and that ridiculous orange notice. The tone was still professional, but there was no mistaking the message. You picked the wrong target. Within 48 hours, she received a reply from the city's health attorney. We will be conducting a full review of the HOA's authority to issue health-related fines. Please retain all documents related to the incident. The tone had shifted. Now it was official. The HOA had poked a bear, and the growl had reached City Hall. The next week, she received a certified letter, not from the HOA this time, but from the city inspector's office. They would be conducting a formal investigation into HOA enforcement practices, not just related to her case, but to all health citations issued in the past 18 months. My mom just smiled. I told them. I warned them. And that was the moment I realized something. This wasn't just about cats anymore. This was about power, misused, unearned, and unchecked. And now it was about to be dismantled, one clipboard at a time. It didn't take long before things started to crack. At first, the HOA tried to act unfazed. No official statements, no public apologies. They kept their usual routine, walking around the neighborhood with their clipboards like nothing was happening. But the confidence in their stride was gone. I could see it. The board members stopped making eye contact with residents. Madeline, yes, we finally learned the HOA president's name, began skipping her afternoon compliance walks. And in our neighborhood, that silence was louder than any announcement. Then came the inspection. One Tuesday morning, 2 city officials parked outside my mom's house in a plain white SUV with municipal plates. They weren't wearing uniforms, just ID badges and leather-bound folders. They walked the property line, took notes, asked a few respectful questions, and requested to see the outdoor enclosure. My mom, ever the professional, gave them the full tour. Sanitation bins, vaccination records, cleaning schedules, even feeding logs. She had it all, printed and color-coded. They were impressed. You run this cleaner than half the licensed shelters we've seen, one of them said. Later that afternoon, they visited the HOA office. That's when things got interesting. See, most people don't know that HOAs have to document every complaint they act on, especially when issuing fines related to health, safety, or community well-being. The investigators asked for the original complaint about the cats. The HOA stalled. They claimed it was anonymous and verbal. When pressed for any written record, they couldn't produce one. No timestamp, no photo evidence, nothing. Strike. 1. Then they were asked to justify the fine amount, $600. The city officials requested the formula they used to calculate the penalty. Again, silence. No policy, no documented precedent. Just arbitrary numbers based on board discretion. Strike 2. But the real nail in the coffin was the wording of the notice they left on my mom's door. The orange threat labeled her property a health hazard and claimed authority under local ordinance codes. Problem is, those codes don't exist, at least not in any form that gives HOAs enforcement power without city review. The inspectors took photos, scanned the document, and asked for legal clarification. The board couldn't provide any. Strike 3. Word started spreading through the neighborhood like wildfire. The HOA was being investigated. Residents who'd once felt alone in their frustrations started coming forward. Mrs. Langley, 3 doors down, mentioned a time she was fined for leaving birdseed on her porch. They said it would attract disease, she told me. Another neighbor was fined for a potential mold hazard because her kids left a damp towel hanging over the back fence. These weren't just overreaches, these were patterns. My mom took it a step further. She organized a quiet gathering at our house. Nothing official, just coffee and conversation. A dozen people showed up, each with their own story and fine slips in hand. One man brought a folder thick with citations from the last year alone. I thought I was the only one, he said. Turns out we've all been targeted. By the end of the night, a community task force had formed. They weren't activists. They weren't rebels. Just regular people who were tired of being bullied in their own homes. My mom helped them draft a collective letter to the city, formally requesting a deeper audit of the HOA's practices. And while all of this was happening, the HOA remained silent. No defense, no public meetings, no acknowledgement of the investigation. But silence, in this case, wasn't strength. It was fear. And fear spreads fast, especially when you're not the one holding the clipboard anymore. The first public blow landed a week later. A short article appeared in our local community news site. Stonebridge Oaks HOA under review for questionable enforcement practices. It wasn't a viral expose, but it didn't need to be. In our neighborhood, where image was everything, a single paragraph was enough to detonate a social bomb. It named no one specifically, but it mentioned unauthorized health fines, resident complaints, and state-level inquiry. Everyone knew exactly who it was about. The HOA board tried to contain the fallout. An emergency newsletter went out the next morning, full of vague language. It mentioned unfounded rumors, respecting due process, and a desire for continued harmony. Not once did it mention the investigation, the article, or my mom's name. And that's what made it worse. The omission screamed guilt. More neighbors began stepping forward. People who once quietly paid their fines out of fear were now emailing the city with their stories. One woman even admitted she'd sold her home months earlier because of constant harassment over garden height violations. The city clerk's inbox filled up. Our case had become a spark. Now it was catching fire. Then the inspectors returned, this time with a different tone. We've expanded our scope, one said. There's enough evidence now to conduct a full compliance audit. That meant a deep dive into everything. Board elections, spending, enforcement, internal communication. It was no longer just about cats. It was about how this HOA had built an empire on intimidation, and no one ever questioned it, until now. Behind the scenes, the board began to fracture. One member resigned, citing personal reasons. Another refused to sign. The next round of citations. They had tasted unchecked authority for years, but now that the mirror was being held up, none of them wanted to see their own reflection. Meanwhile, the remaining loyalists scrambled to look unified, pressuring residents to remember who keeps the neighborhood running. But it was too late. No one was buying the act anymore. At the next community meeting, something extraordinary happened. My mom didn't speak. She didn't need to. Other residents stood up instead. They demanded transparency. They read excerpts from the city code. One man even quoted a section of the HOA's own bylaws, proving that the fines issued were not only unjustified, but procedurally invalid. There was no shouting, no chaos, just cold, calm truth. Madeline finally spoke near the end of the meeting. Her voice was thin, her expression tight. "We've always acted in the best interest of the community," she said. That was her defense. No facts, no apology, just ego wrapped in self-righteousness. And that's when Mrs. Langley, of all people, stood up and replied, "You acted in the interest of control, not care." The room fell silent. No one clapped. No one needed to. The message had landed like a gavel strike. Madeline sat down and didn't say another word. And just like that, the invincible image of the HOA cracked for good. By the time the full audit report was published, the damage was done. Pages of violations, financial mismanagement, improper fine structures, abuse of discretionary authority, the city's recommendation, immediate restructure, and pending review of all citations issued under false pretenses. The HOA board issued a single final statement. "We are stepping down to allow the community a fresh start." No signatures, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. But it didn't matter. The resignation was all we needed. The empire of fines, threats, and intimidation had fallen. All because they underestimated a woman who just wanted to take care of cats. With the old board gone, the neighborhood felt like it had taken its first real breath in years. No more cryptic notices, no more late-night anxiety about whether your porch light was too bright or your lawn too long. The silence that followed, their resignation wasn't empty. It was peaceful. For the first time, the streets felt open again, like they belonged to the people who actually lived there. A temporary committee was formed, made up of volunteers, teachers, veterans, retirees, single parents, real neighbors, people who knew each other's names and stories, not just addresses and violations. Their goal wasn't to punish or control. It was to listen and rebuild. My mom didn't take a leadership role, despite everyone asking her to. She just smiled and said, "I'll help when needed, but I'm not here to rule. I'm here to heal." And she meant it. She offered to assist with policy revisions, pro bono. She helped the new committee draft a resident-friendly code of conduct, with input from actual legal advisors and municipal partners. Every rule was clearly written, fair, and publicly posted. No more fine print, no more interpretations. And most importantly, no more fear. One of the first things the new board did was announce a review of every single fine issued under the previous regime. If it was found to be unjust, it would be refunded. Some people got checks in the mail. Others received handwritten apologies. One elderly resident cried when she received a refund for a $300 fine over improper window blinds. She thought that money had just vanished. Now it came back, with dignity. Community engagement exploded. Residents started attending meetings, not out of obligation, but curiosity. People volunteered for neighborhood projects, cleaning up the park, repainting the playground, organizing a community garden. Even the Facebook group, once full of passive-aggressive posts and complaints, turned into a hub for babysitter requests and Saturday yard sales. It was like someone had turned the neighborhood inside out, and everything dark had finally been exposed to sunlight. The biggest change, though, was cultural. People started talking to each other again, not just nodding at the mailbox, but really talking. Families who had lived next door for years were finally learning each other's names. Kids from opposite ends of the block were riding bikes together. What once felt like a war zone of silent judgment was slowly becoming a real community. My mom, of course, kept feeding the cats. But now, instead of hiding them, she gave them names, made little name tags, posted photos at the community board with adoption info. She turned her quiet act of kindness into a model of compassion, and no one complained. In fact, one family ended up adopting 2 of the rescues. They named them Justice and Harmony. Fitting. One afternoon, the new board installed a small wooden bench near the park with a simple brass plaque. It read, "For those who care quietly, but stand loudly when it matters." It wasn't signed, but we all knew who it was for. As for the former HOA president, no one's really sure where she went. Rumor has it she moved to another gated community a few towns over. I just hope, for her sake, she reads the bylaws a little more carefully next time, and maybe Googles the neighbors first. The neighborhood isn't perfect now. It still has its quirks, its disagreements, its barking dogs and crying babies. But it feels alive again, honest, human. And every time I see my mom sipping tea on the porch, cats curled up beside her, I'm reminded that sometimes the biggest changes start with something as small as a bowl of food. Weeks turned into months, and the storm faded into memory. But its impact didn't. Every street in that neighborhood still bore the subtle marks of change, less in the structures, more in the spirit. It was in the way people waved to one another, in the unlocked fences between backyards, in the garden boxes that popped up where warning signs used to stand. The fear that once gripped this place like a vice had disappeared, replaced with something much harder to create. Trust. My mom never celebrated publicly. She didn't boast or remind people of what she had done. She didn't need to. Her silence was her victory. The cats kept coming, so did the kindness. People dropped off supplies now. Bags of food, folded blankets, even handmade toys. The same neighbors who once feared HOA retaliation now helped her build insulated shelters for winter. One kid drew her a comic book titled "The Cat Lady Who Saved the Neighborhood." She framed it. It amazed me how quickly things could change once power was placed in the right hands, or better yet, shared. No one wanted another tyrant. They wanted fairness. They wanted respect. That was the real legacy. Not just what my mom accomplished, but how she did it. Without screaming, without threats, without rage. Just documents, laws, and unshakable confidence in doing the right thing. I remember one afternoon sitting on her porch, watching the sun dip behind the row of houses that once felt like cages. "Do you ever miss the old way things were?" I asked, half joking. She sipped her tea, smiled softly, and said, "I miss the quiet, but I love the noise we have now." The sound she meant was life. Kids laughing, neighbors chatting, cats meowing softly as they wandered between yards. It was messy, sure, but it was real. Then, one day, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. No return address, just my mom's name, neatly typed in all caps. Inside was a formal apology, signed by the former HOA president herself. 3 typed pages, no excuses, no backpedaling, just an admission of overreach, acknowledgement of harm, and a line that stood out like a spotlight. "You taught me that leadership doesn't mean control, it means responsibility." My mom folded the letter and placed it in the same drawer where she'd kept the original fine notice, the one that started everything. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder, a full circle moment. Proof that even the proud can learn. That even the most rigid systems can bend without breaking. People began asking her to speak. Other HOAs, neighborhood groups, even city committees. They wanted to hear her story. Understand how one woman, with a clipboard full of facts and a backyard full of cats, brought down an oppressive board and replaced it with something better. She turned most offers down, but once in a while, she'd accept. Not to be admired, but to educate. "I'm not a hero," she always said. "I'm just someone who knew the rules better than the ones trying to enforce them." And that was the difference. That's what won, because in the end, this wasn't just about a cat shelter. It was about the cost of silence, the strength of patience, and the power of knowing when to speak and when to let the truth speak for itself.